Hello, everybody. This is Jung Chul-shin, professor at the Department of Education, Seoul National University. It is my honor to chair this special session titled Future of Education in Asia. Let me briefly summarize the background of this session. After pandemic, a lot of things has been changed a lot. And we want to talk about some issues related to how we have been responding to this rapid change on the pandemic. And then after this pandemic, we're going to talk about the changes, recovery of in the field of education. And then how can we understand these changes from the pedagogical point of view so that we can talk about the new pedagogical issues in the future after this pandemic. Today we have three well-known presenters. First presenter is Professor Cheol Lim, professor at the Seoul National University. Professor Lim, would you say hello to your audience?
Okay. Hi.
Hi, thank you very much.
This is Cheol Lim from Seoul National University.
Professor Lim is a professor at the Department of Education, Seoul National University. He is the chairperson of the Korean Association of Creativity Studies, and he is a former chairperson of the Korean Association of Educational Technology. And our second presenter is Professor David Wei-Long Hong. Professor.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much. And Professor Hong is a professor of National Institute of Education, Dean of Educational Research. His field of research is educational technology and learning science, I think. And our third presenter is Professor Keita Takayama. Hello, Professor Takayama. Good to see you. Professor Takayama is a professor at Kyoto University, and he has a lot of manager position. And he is an academic council member of Kyoto University and managing board member of Kyoto University Press and director of Global Education Office. These three guest invited speakers will talk about education and educational change on the pandemic. I would not use a lot of my time for this chairing, but shall we invite Professor Cheol Lim first for delivering his speech?
Yep. Okay.
The floor is yours.
Just a second. Okay, so it's a little bit echoing, but anyway, good to see you, the other members of this session. Nice to meet you all. And I'm so pleased to be invited in this session as a special session. And let me share what I have observed and what I have experienced in the name of transforming educational crisis into opportunity, Korean education during the COVID-19 pandemic. So my main presentation is starting from what is called new normal in education. So that like distance education now becomes a kind of normal in education, not anymore face-to-face education during the COVID-19. All the schools, primary, secondary, and higher educations. So it becomes a normal in education in Korea. But we sometimes call this one as an emergency education. The distance education is up to the front as an emergency entity, so that there is kind of educational crisis in terms of the result and the process. So I would like to analyze what are the results and process, and then try to make this kind of emergency or a crisis into a new opportunities for the long-term educational challenges. Okay. So one of the fact that I would like to share with you from the Korean situation. We call it educational crisis. For instance, in terms of the results, there is an increase in achievement gap of primary and secondary schools, not the university and not at this point. So as you can see this chart, there is a grade on seventh grade math result in 2019, the year before Corona. So this one looks like this, kind of a normal curve, so that many middle-range students are around here, and then lower level, upper level. But one of the testing results showed that 2020, after the Corona, 8th grade math result shows the red one, so that the students in the middle part became the lower level students. And a little bit interesting point is that some of them reached to the upper level. So this is a typical result we have right now. So there is a great concern that the gap between the lower level and upper level is increasing. That's one concern. And the other concern we have is in terms of the process. We observe that there is lower interaction or feedback from the prospective students in university, not necessarily the primary and the secondary, but many students in the universities said that the interaction level is lower than they expected. So they ask for more interactions in the class. So these are typical results and the process as we experience the pandemic situation last year and also a little bit part of this year. But what I observed is that there is also a kind of new opportunities for long-term educational challenges. What I mean by educational challenge is that we are looking for adaptive learning for individual different level and then the achievement. How we provide adaptive learning is kind of long-term challenge which is not successful, which has not been so successful in the previous years. And another part is how we support learner motivation. What I observed from the Zoom interaction among, this is a Zoom class in primary student, they are trying to learn the data analysis in the Zoom situation. And what I observed is that the teacher interact with the students so that the teacher tried to be more adaptive, the students' needs and the current status. So I'm sure that this kind of environment is very adaptive to students' level and then also the different needs. So it's kind of a very positive factor or phenomena that I observed. And also the other one that you might be very familiar with, the what is called metaverse application. This is called Gather Town. And this application becomes very popular for the past 3 or 4 months in primary and secondary and even in higher education. Even I used this Gather Town class because in this Gather Town, the small group activities are quite easy, so that the students, 3 or 4, they work together in a group in the Gather Town situation. So it is more realistic in terms of the representing the classroom situation. So this is one good application. So it is even better for the students who would like to have more participation and engagement, which is not quite easy in the traditional classroom. So this is a good indicator that distance education using this kind of metaverse also very motivating and stimulating the students' participation. So I observed this is a good sign for the next level of education in the future. So I observed the crisis. Also, I observed the some kind of opportunities for new mode of the education. And as I observed these phenomena, the government offered some policies for primary and secondary education in Korea last year and this year. So let me introduce what the government point of view to secure the new challenges. So this is the key policy direction, green and smart education in 2021. So the government tried to initiate a business plan for which is called Green Smart School of the Future, a flagship project of the Korean New Deal. Okay, so it tried to support the transition to the future education by remodeling and also remodeling the school facilities. As you can see, this is one typical classroom that is remodeled in the pandemic situation. So in this environment, the students work together using the smart devices, and also it is a eco-friendly smart education environment under the Zero Energy Initiative. So what the government is trying to have as we experience the pandemic, we would like to have smart classrooms that allow a diverse learning experiences. So what I said is that all the classrooms have the Wi-Fi services from last semester, and then probably at the end of this semester, all the classroom nationwide have the Wi-Fi access. Surprisingly, the Korea do not have Wi-Fi services all the classroom before the pandemic. So the pandemic makes the government put a lot of investment to have smart classrooms so that they will have more efficient ways for the student to use their devices in the classroom or in their home. So both environment, the student can access to the Wi-Fi environment. And another policy is one device for one student. It will be probably implemented successfully within 2 or 3 years. But anyway, from this year, the government is starting to push this policy, one device for one student. Okay, so what I'm saying is that in the process of pandemic situation, the government think that the smart education will be very good leverage for distance and also for the classroom situation, what we call blended learning situation. Okay, so this is what I just told you is about the primary and secondary national policy. What about the higher education policies? Let me just share what the government is trying to say under this pandemic situation. So one of them is that establishing a new normal in academic management. So what I'm saying new normal is that traditionally distance education in Korea is not well implemented in the regular universities. But through the pandemic situation, the government deregulate the distance education system so that all the universities now officially can provide the distance education degree program from last year. So like this, and also the what is called online joint degree is now offered by all the university without any regulations. So like a master program for different domestic universities, and also master and bachelor programs for domestic and foreign universities. So what I'm saying is that through this pandemic process, the regular university now can provide distance education without any regulation. That's a huge change from the perspective of the Korean situation. And also, one very interesting part is how the government is trying to cultivating student digital literacy. So about 100,000 students will be trained in the new technology sector. So there is a, which is called innovative consortium system of university in digital and new technology. So professional training in the field of new technology and also new technology major for everyone is now provided by all different types of universities. This is a huge change comparing with the traditional university programs. And also, the government is trying to ensure the internal stability of distance education in higher education for the post-COVID-19 era. For instance, the government made some major centers for distance education so that the capacity building of the professors will be trained through this center and also trying to support to create different types of online content. So each university have their own distance education center, which have not been well established before the COVID-19. Also, the government make a distance education management committee so that evaluate different type of distance courses and also the developing quality assurance system. So the center and also the committee are developed by each universities under the guidance of government. Also, obviously, financial support from the government. So more specifically, and also the government asked the university to provide vocational training and lifelong learning as we go through the pandemic. So students who have some difficulties for employment due to the COVID-19, they have short-term courses in new technology and also establishing department course under contract with other companies. Also, the government emphasizing the new technology AR or VR so that more efficient and effective programs is provided to the university level student. So what I'm trying to say in this presentation is that now as we go through the pandemic, we try to transform this kind of crisis into new opportunities. So all the sectors, primary, secondary, higher education, they are trying to make a new educational horizon using different types of technology. Also, through this process, what I'm saying, quality education in online and blended learning is trying to be provided in terms of accessibility and interaction for motivation. And then, so as we go through these practice and government policies, we are trying to make a systematic research and application in Seoul, Korea, in different universities and also different institutes, and then also trying to be more beyond the smart education and into what is called sustainable development. This is a new directions, which is not so clear at this point, but anyway, not just stopping smart education, but go to more than smart education into sustainable development. So through this session, I would like to share what we experienced in Korea, and then also what we have in Korea, or what we call insight with other countries. So I hope we can have more co-work and exchange the programs, and would like to have more collaborative research. Okay, thank you. That's what I have pretty much.
Thank you, Professor Lim. Professor Lim highlighted some kind of changes after pandemic. For example, learning environment improved a lot after pandemic, and national policy become very flexible and relevant to changing education environment. And then education practice have been changed a lot after pandemic. Because of these changes, we perceive the pandemic is an opportunity as well as it is a big threat. So that we have two. One is a positive dimension, the other one is negative dimension. How to handle this? That's one of our critical issues to address in the future. Our next presenter is Professor David Wei-Long Hong. His presentation will focusing on close relationship between learning science research and educational practice development. Please welcome Professor Wong with your applause.
Thank you very much. Are you able to see my screen?
We cannot see your screen. Okay, now we see it. Thank you very much.
Now you see it?
Yeah, you have 15 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you and your screen
Okay,
too.
all right. So as the chairman has articulated, how can we turn the crisis into an opportunity? And so since this conference is about educational research, I was hoping to leverage on what we can do better now that we have seen this crisis in terms of what researchers in the university can contribute and to make an impact to the school system, just as what Professor Lim earlier has mentioned, and how we can potentially use this opportunity to develop the kinds of needed student competencies that are so necessary for a very unpredictable future that we all have experienced recently. So in Singapore, I just want to let you know that in spite of the pandemic, schools have relatively remained open. And the whole notion of online learning and blended learning has taken a new form because of home-based learning, because students have to stay at home. But of course, when they stay at home, parents too got to be at home. So it's a whole societal matter. And we have to be cognizant of those families where the home settings are not as good as those more well-to-do families. And so while technology creates many opportunities, the inhibitors that were before the pandemic and now the inhibitors become realities more as enablers, but our students who are disadvantaged or from the lower social economic status, they are the ones that still need to be even the more looked after. So I just want to say that that's a preamble, and I just want to share how in Singapore we have leveraged upon the opportunities given because there is a resurgence in the understanding of learning, and especially learning for the disadvantaged, for the special needs, and for the lower progressing students, and how we can potentially work together with other faculty throughout the university in order to understand learning and to bring learning into impactful trajectories out there in the schools and the classrooms. All this require a whole systemic solution, and I hope to share some of it this afternoon. So basically, like what I shared, the home-based learning has become something of a mainstay. But unfortunately, what I realized is that some of the research that we have done in earlier years, in virtual worlds, for example, because they are more expensive, so what happens is that the government has kind of like curtailed some of the funding for such efforts. But on hindsight, because of a black swan phenomena that most people cannot predict, I think what government funders should now think about is that they should think of future scenarios and not present scenarios. And if we had funded some of these virtual reality, augmented reality, and blended learning in a more forceful fashion, I think the benefits and the fruits would have been better translated out in schools during this pandemic. Yeah. So I just like to say that there is a need to close the gap between policy and practice, and there is a real need to bring the so-called research to translational practice or from bench to bedside, if I were to use the medical metaphor. And even when there are times where we don't see that such investments can really are that necessary, especially in a small country like Singapore. If we had invested in some of these virtual worlds, perhaps even today in the home-based settings, for students who don't have the physical luxuries of a good home and conducive environment, perhaps these virtual worlds could have been better deployed. Yeah, but I just want to say that hindsight is always easy to look back, but when we are trajectorying towards educational research pathway from bench to bedside, from upstream to downstream practice contexts, such hindsight wisdom is often lacking. But I hope that post this endeavor, pandemic, we might be able to do things better. So you can see that there affords many opportunities, especially in lifelong learning, where the formal and informal curriculum is kind of more blur now. And we do need to invest more in the informal, because if we are able to motivate students better, then we can foster these lifelong learning pathways and trajectories for the students. We also want to blur the lines between academic and vocational. In Singapore, we had this history that if you are more academic, you are better advantaged in the national high stakes exams. If you are more vocational, maybe you won't do that well. And but I think today's real world and fast growing world shows that the academic and vocational are equally important. And today, mental well-being and the affective dimensions and the emotional dimensions in complement to cognitive dimensions is a lot more prominent than previously construed. And of course, the physical and virtual worlds are blurring, and students need to navigate to and fro many of these worlds. Do our students have these competencies going forward, and are they able to be prepared for these uncertain futures with the skill sets and competencies to navigate many of these boundaries and affinity spaces in a more seamless fashion? So to reiterate, I just feel that in education research, I'll come back to this diagram towards the end, but really we need to think system. And in terms of system, I would like to focus that there are macro dimensions of policymakers where they put conditions in the system to enable, just now Prof. Lim was talking about the national policies with respect to distance education. So school system structures and national high stakes exams are macro policies that would support or otherwise the kinds of intentions that we hope to seed and to scale up in our school system. And then at the micro level, we have the teachers and we have caregivers, we have social workers who now work in schools, because education in schools is not just cognitive, but very much to do with well-being and social emotional learning. So how do we work together as a community in order to take our research evidence and translate it all the way to practice? And practice world is quite different from the research world. And we need to, as researchers, broker upwards to policymakers to convince them that the evidence speaks for itself, and broker downwards to practitioners, because they are the ones who implement our kinds of our advocated research. Okay, and so I'll come back to this in a moment. So in Singapore, we have this opportunity because recently the government funded us very much in what we call science of learning, or SOL. But science of learning is very much contributed by the medical folks, the cognitive science, and the psychologists. And they look into the neuroscience or the cognitive functionings in the brain. And then in education, we have spent many years looking into the design and the pedagogical aspects of quality interaction that students can be afforded if they are given a learning environment that is conducive. And this learning environment can be both physical, can be virtual, can be the curricular resources that are afforded to them. But how do we actually create that interface between that cognitive human functioning of it, which is individual factors, and the environment and the environmental factors that can provide for this interplay between the individual and the environment, and of which teachers sit right in the center of this interface in order to broker that learning opportunity to be as authentic as possible for the learner and for the student in this environment. So as I said earlier, there are these technologies. If only we had invested them with foresight that these things, the black swan situations would come, I wish that we would have done this in a better way, albeit more expensive. And science of learning is able to work alongside these augmented reality technologies because science of learning look into the cognitive functionings, whereas these technologies afford the environmental conditions, virtual or otherwise, in order to enable that learning interaction to take place. So in Singapore, we aim to derive ecologically valid interventions across the lifespan from early childhood all the way to adult learning to be able to develop these interventions that are age appropriate. And then we aim to find out what the mechanisms are, the factors that contribute to learning, and for different learners, whether they are so-called lower progressing or higher or faster progressing across the K-12 lifespan. And so I want to just to iterate that the science of learning in education is an opportunity to look into the cognitive processes before they are manifested in the observable behaviors. So for example, stress. Stress is something that is sometimes hidden, and science of learning with its physiological senses would be able to give us some of these hidden data before they are manifested. And sometimes I think such data would be able to be quite informative to educate us as to differentiating the kinds of instructions that teachers would to deploy in classrooms. So the science of learning in Singapore is now an opportunity where we literally work with faculty across the university. We have sort of partnerships with the medical faculty. And you know, many of these empirical researchers start with animal studies at T1 and then move to very narrow samples in terms of human populations, but they seldom cross the chasm to T3 and T4. And then in education, because we know that experimental studies do not work because they are too controlled, we start from the classroom and then we have so many variables at hand that it becomes sometimes policymakers find it hard to justify our overly complicated models. So here is a chance for us to do the reverse, where there are already interventions that work in classrooms, but we can constrain and prioritize those variables in order to figure out what works more critically compared to others. And then if we are able to do so, then policymakers would be able to have a prioritization mechanism for funding the most critical, and then over time doing and increasing the variables that allow for that deployment in classrooms. So I just want to reiterate that all three dimensions, the individual, the environment, and the interactional factors, are important for education, for a translational pathway from bench to bedside. And so hopefully we would, through this effort that we have in Singapore with funding from the government, to be able to cohere the bio-ecological dimensions, biology, all the way to sustainability in the social ecology, in order to make these things work in real practice. And then the interventions hopefully can begin from early age all the way till adolescence. And then we hopefully can prevent the stacking of risk, especially if we can do the numeracy and literacy well. Now we need to include social emotional well-being right from early years, including dimensions like self-control, in order to create the kinds of dispositions needed to succeed in the future endeavor and the future unpredictable situations that are besetting many students in going forward. So in a nutshell, just to sum up, there's a need in science of learning in education, where education is juxtaposed with science of learning. And education, I would characterize it as the learning sciences, which we are quite familiar with. Science of learning, less familiar, but we are now courageously working with our folks across the university, but importantly, putting in place the research policy practice nexus. And so let me just conclude by again saying that we need to bridge this research policy practice nexus. Researchers are operating at the meso level. We need to influence the policymakers at the macro level if we want to see our research evidence produce impact and sustainable pathways in schools. We need to work with caregivers, teachers, and social workers in order to create science of learning in education efficacies for both cognitive and affective dimensions. And we want to develop not just the research methodological skill sets, but the brokering abilities to create an ecologically sustainable community where our research evidence can find traction from research all the way to practice. So whether we are doing research in augmented reality, distance education, or in any other dimension, we need the entire pipeline from research evidence in a systematic fashion, looking through the classroom evidences, looking through the sustainable mechanisms for these classroom enactments, and influencing our funders to continue to create research to practice translational pathways to sustain that work, so much so until when the next pandemic comes, we would be more than prepared to cope with such situations. So that's all I have in my presentation. Thank you very much.
Professor Wong, thank you very much. Thank you for your timely presentation. When we ask to practitioner, education practitioner, does research matter for your practice development? Maybe we got answer from them like, why, I'm not sure. Because it is not easy to link between research and practice in the field of education. However, you proposed very critical and important model to how to make close nexus between your pedagogical research and also practice development. Thank you very much. When we talk about research and practice development, one of the core issues is like localization of our research our knowledge production. Let's say when we produce a lot of knowledge, but in many cases it does not contribute to our practice development. From the point of view, localization of knowledge production is very critical in the field of education because education field is practice-oriented field. From the point of view, I would be happy to introduce Professor Keita Takayama because his own research topic is related to the relevance of research. And today's presentation we're focusing on the reconceptualization of the pedagogical practice in its conceptual framework. Please welcome Professor Takayama.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the kind introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me well? And then can you see the screen, the screen that I'm sharing with you? Perfect.
Would you speak a little bit louder?
Oh, speak louder. Okay, but can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. So thanks very much for extending the kind invitation to me. I am based in Kyoto University. But I visited the Seoul National University in 2016. So I've met a lot of people, a lot of graduate students and colleagues at the Seoul National. So it is a pity that I have not been able to return to Seoul National ever since. But thanks again for the kind opportunity to speak to you today. So my piece is going to be very different from the two presentations that you saw up to now. I'm going to take more a sociological and a philosophical approach, and my piece is going to be a bit more personal and reflective. So I'm going to start with my own experience, and I'll use my experience as a point of departure for a deeper conversation about how we can reconceptualize education as a result of COVID-19 and the disruption that it has caused. Because I'm not so confident finishing my presentation in 15 minutes. 15 minutes, a very short period of time. I have decided to read as opposed to speak today. So forgive me for reading for the next 15 minutes, but I actually timed myself and I know that my talk is going to finish in 14 minutes and 32 seconds. Okay, and I stress the time because my talk is going to be really focusing on the notion of time. So do you have any advice about how we can stay productive during the COVID-19 pandemic? Someone who seemed like an early career researcher asked this question to a panel of presenters, including myself, in a virtual conference held in April 2020. Prior to that event, I had been unwell for a little over 3 weeks. It was a deeply unnerving experience, as I had some of the typical COVID symptoms. And yet, my symptoms were not serious enough for diagnostic testing. So this meant that there was no way for me to know exactly why I was sick. After a prolonged period of the self-isolation at home, I only got well enough to participate in the panel. I don't think we can, and perhaps we should not even be trying either. I said something to that effect in response to the question. Research productivity was the last thing to worry about when not only my own, but also my whole family's health was at a possible risk. So as soon as I started self-isolating at home, I noticed one morning the beautiful singing of a Japanese nightingale. It's called uguisu in Japanese. And I don't know how many of them were actually around. Perhaps it was only one bird enchanting us with a beautiful singing, beautiful chirping every 10 seconds or so. I was pleasantly surprised, as I did not think they live in our neighborhood in the northern part of Kyoto where I live. How come I did not notice it before? Have they been singing every morning since we moved to Kyoto 6 months ago? Or would it be the case that now that my life has sufficiently slowed down, I am attentive enough to the surroundings to hear the singing? Or would it be the case that the reduced human activities have brought nature back to the city, so more birds and animals feel safe enough to be in the urban space? Indeed, COVID-19 completely changed the outlook of this ancient capital city, Kyoto, the world-famous international tourist destination. Local people say that we are back to Kyoto some 30, 40 years ago, when it was still nice and quiet. It was not just the singing of the nightingales and slowing down in life that I noticed because of the pandemic. It also did something to the very experience of time. As American sociologist Peter Berger in 1977 once explained, one of the 5 dilemmas imposed by modernity on human life is futurity. Futurity, what he means by that is a profound change in the temporal structure of human experience, in which the future becomes the primary orientation for both imagination and activity. So the modern notion of time, or the clock time, is premised upon progressive linearity. Time is conceived as precise, measurable, and, at least in principle, subject to human control. Everyday technological devices with all sorts of scheduling and time management apps further promotes this trend, imposing a functional understanding of time as chunkable, single purpose, linear, and ownable. They help us calculate and coordinate every second of our private and professional lives towards future certainties. So this logic of futurity was completely shattered by COVID-19, albeit momentarily. Not knowing how soon the pandemic could be brought under control and how widespread the virus infection was, we were forced to spend day after day at home with the deepest sense of uncertainty about the future, simply hoping for better the next day. We quickly lost our sense of time as our weekly routines were completely disrupted. Futurity was gone, as the future was no longer secure and foreseen. All the meetings, conferences, and travels scheduled for the next few months were wiped out of my calendar, with all due dates and deadlines suddenly turning inconsequential. In response to the pandemic, universities around the world jumped to the online mode of teaching. It was the university's desperate attempt to bring back in its operation a secured sense of futurity. Indeed, university is a thoroughly modern institution. in terms of how futurity is built into its operation. The temporal bread and butter of university is the compartmentalization of teaching and learning into terms within which students are implicitly taught to develop time management skills and dispositions. Course plans are laid out with all the projected learning outcomes clearly spelled out before the term begins. Intellectual activities are punctuated with weekly progressive coverage of different topics, culminating in a set of tasks and activities that are to be completed by the students in a time-sensitive manner. All these temporal regulatory measures are in place to render the process of learning linear and predictable. These measures can remove the essential weakness of education, which is precisely what makes education worthy of its name. That is, the notion of education as subjectification, according to education philosopher Gerd Biesta, who I believe is speaking in a different session at the moment. In the face of a learning loss brought by the pandemic, many of us end up teaching online in a business as usual way without disrupting the temporal normativity of university education. Peter Berger reminds us a romantic rejection of futurity is not practical in our thoroughly modernized life. Indeed, many modern institutions, ranging from macroeconomic policies to public transports, must operate on the basis of futurity so that modern convenience and security will be ensured. But what about universities? Historically, universities played a critical role in the early introduction of so-called clock time in many parts of the world. Today, the hyper-intensified form of modern temporal logic has dominated everyday life at the university, when world university rankings powerfully condition our places of life, our places of intellectual work. Some of us are deeply concerned about the dire implications of this for the nature of knowledge we produce, and implications for the potential of education for democratic polity. And going back to the initial question posed by the early career researcher, how in the world has it become sensible for an early career researcher to talk about research in terms of productivity, that is, in terms of the quantifiable outputs measured within a set time frame? And most disturbingly, this happened when the whole of humanity was living in fear of the global pandemic. Hence, we might want to ask, borrowing Peter Berger's words, how and in what area of the university may it be possible to do without clocks and calendars? So the photo here on the left is the Kyoto University clock tower, and I believe the one on the right is a clock tower, small clock tower somewhere on the Seoul National campus. Just when I was thinking about all this, I came across a small article column in a local newspaper here in Kyoto, titled Margins of Lectures, 授業の余白 in Japanese. The column raised concerns about the unintended consequences of online teaching for university lectures. The margins of lectures refers to those accidental moments of learning, including when, for example, lecturers would go off topic and yet end up talking about something more meaningful to the students than the carefully sequenced lectures. It could also include when students engage in a spontaneous discussion off campus, perhaps in a cafes or bars, about books and arguments introduced during the formal lectures, when they share with each other relevant books and articles for further independent studies. The column introduced a voices of university students today in Japan, attesting to the disappearance of serendipitous moments of learning. when online has completely replaced face-to-face on-campus learning in Japanese universities? How do we ensure that our online mode of learning is structured in a way to allow for ample margins, or yohaku, or in BS's words, weakness, so that accidental and yet more profoundly meaningful forms of learning continue to take place? Moving the clock forward, it is October 2021, nearly 2 years since the outbreak of COVID. The case of infections has dropped significantly in the last several weeks in Japan with a rising rate of vaccination, and yet the COVID is still with us. We have become so accustomed to living with COVID, and things have become pretty much normalized apart from international traveling. Unfortunately, normalization of COVID-19 has come with the normalization of futurity in my day-to-day life. My hours are filled with online meetings back to back, like this, with some international meetings scheduled way beyond my work hours, 10 o'clock at night, 3 o'clock in the morning. My 2021 calendar has been quickly filled with numerous appointments and deadlines, including, I must add, the deadline for this presentation. And I'm very sad to report that I no longer hear the Japanese nightingales singing beautifully in the morning. Do they only appear in our neighborhood in springtime? Or is their disappearance due to the fact that my daily life has regained its temporal normativity and lost margins? Though nightingales are no longer with me, the reflection they triggered has had a lasting impact on me, and this is already visible in my current online teaching. To create margins in my course, I always begin and finish the weekly classes with informal conversation about anything that comes to my mind and invite students to engage with my thoughts and feelings. And I constantly drift off from the course plan and let my students do the same. And this means that I have to constantly alter the course plan, bringing in a different set of readings depending upon where the conversation takes us each week. Whatever little sense of temporal progression and linearity underpinning my original course plan has been thrown away. And the most exciting and embarrassing of all is the fact that I did not even know till the last few weeks of the term how many hours my weekly classes were supposed to be and how many seminars I was supposed to hold. I learned for the first time after being at the Kyoto University for 2 years about these clocks and calendar matters when somehow perplexed administrative staff downstairs corrected my timetable request for the next academic year, explaining that my graduate seminar is supposed to be for 1.5 hours per class, as opposed to 2 hours as I requested, and for the duration of 15 weeks. As you can tell, I do not pride myself on organizational administrative skills. Probably the student didn't want to embarrass me by pointing out my glaring errors, but when asked in the class why they did not correct me, they all laughed at the fact that it had taken me this long to realize my mistakes. And then they simply said that it did not matter to them too much. Reflecting on the moment, I now realize that perhaps it was a good thing, as they might have suggested that my students and I managed to create a learning experience where clocks and calendars were not that important. As you can see, contrary to the view of COVID as causing so-called learning loss, along with the singing of Japanese nightingales, the COVID has, at least to me, provided a pedagogical moment of reflection, an opportunity to question the underpinning notion of time in teaching and learning, and to explore ways to disrupt and transcend it so that we can begin to reconceptualize education in a slightly different way. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Takayama. Before pandemic, I had no time to enjoy my family meetings, or I didn't have a chance to look around my neighbors or my community. But after pandemic, I had a chance to talk a lot with my family, and I had a chance to look around my community and neighbors. But now my schedule is becoming busier and busier again, so I am come back to normal life. Okay, we have about 15 minutes to discuss our topic today. So I would like to manage this discussion time a little bit efficient way. We are given 4 questions, but let me ask one single question to you for starting our discussion session. My question is like this: will school system sustain in the future? That's a simple but big question. We experienced new things during the pandemic. Then, is there any logic to make school system sustainable in the future? If we want a school system in the future, what changes we need? Okay, I believe that Professor Takayama has some idea about it from his sociological perspective. Would you start first? Do we need school in the future?
So I just want to understand the question properly here. So you're asking whether or not school can be sustainable?
Yes.
Or are you saying that the school is actually serving the needs of making our society sustainable?
Well, I think my question is first one.
Okay. When you use the term sustainable or sustainability, my initial response is that I think we need to talk about not only economic sustainability, not only social sustainability, but more importantly, I think everything hinges on whether or not the Earth itself is sustainable. The ecological system, whether or not the ecological system is sustainable at the moment, and whether or not education system is helping us to address the ecological crisis that we're facing today. So I'm slightly reframing your question in the way that I think is very urgent at the moment. And if you look at the some of the statistics, there's an interesting study by Jeremy Rapley, Hikaru Komatsu, and Yvette Silova, those scholars in international education, sociological education. Their study suggests the more educated you are, the more destructive you become towards the environment. If you look at all the economically advanced societies, highly educated societies, they are the one who are actually destroying the earth. So there's an interesting inverse correlation between the amount of education one receives and sustainability, whether or not one is going to have sustainable life. Mm-hmm. To me, this is the deepest contradiction that we are faced with, because we tend to think that the more we are educated, the more conscious we become, so that we're going to address the ecological challenges that we face today. But the data seems to be suggesting that the reverse is the case. Education is actually making us even more destructive to the environment.
Okay, if we are more educated, then it has much side effect on us or our social life. In the case, do we need education, especially through the schooling system? because let's say after pandemic, there's a lot of criticisms on schooling system. Of course, we can overcome some problems or limitations of the schooling system through the technological development. But from other perspective, we recognize that our current schooling system has a lot of bad things to human life. As you mentioned about more educated people do bad things for the society or to us. So I would invite Professor Lim or Professor Hong about your perspective on this issue.
Okay, let me start my ideas about your big question, whether the school will be remaining or not. What I'm guessing is that you said already that there are great weaknesses in the current schooling system as we reflect on the COVID-19. But interestingly enough, there is a great strength in the schooling system, as the school have the caring system for young children, students. I mean, the home could not support all the caring to their kids. And suddenly they found that school is a good place for them to play around, not necessarily learning. So one thing that I have noticed that even in the universities, students get together, and then they have more social interaction in the schooling rather than just learning. So that is one strength that school has previously, and I'm sure that it will be enduring. But the other thing that I am thinking about is that as we go through the distance education, not necessarily they come to the school, the students can learn all the sites, so that I am expecting the schooling system will be diversified, not necessarily typical one schooling system. So we anticipate there will be different types of schools, not necessarily by the government regulated schools. There will be different types of schools which can utilize different types of educational technologies so that more adaptive environment of the schooling will be possible. So my point is that as the school will be staying, not necessarily the traditional version, one model, but different types of versions of models. So we will look forward to develop different types of the schooling system as we go through the pandemic. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Lim. And Professor Wong, do you have any comment or reflection on
Yeah,
this
okay.
topic?
Okay. So if I just take your question, will schools remain? My answer is sure, yes. Okay. But let me try to unpack this. Just now, Professor Takayama talked about his experience with quality conversations, not necessarily in the prescribed curriculum, where he had with his students pre or post the class. So in the olden days of the Greek philosophers, there was a lot of quality, critical, conversational interactions between the philosophers and their students. So we look at today's prenatal studies, and these studies are even suggesting that if parents that are more highly educated are able to even have these conversations with their fetus in the womb, it kind of predicts their potentiality for success. Now it gets a little hard to accept all this, right? But to some extent, there's evidence to suggest all this. So to me, going back to basics is quality of interaction, quality of thinking, quality of problem solving, quality of moral reasoning. Now, what happens to a child that doesn't have that quality mother-child relationship? So you need somewhere else, right? You need a school. You need a community somewhere. So I would like to suggest that schools perhaps don't be so clockwise, clockwork in the curriculum, which I think policymakers have to fulfill some key performance indicators. But if schools can be a community where this quality of interaction occurs between the more senior students with the less senior ones, between teachers and students, and we are able to facilitate at the end of the day, whatever we do, that those interactions, and then we are able to use technology, augment it with whatever is face-to-face, because I'm still a much believer of face-to-face, and we are able to achieve the same end goal and relook into curricular demands, assessment demands, high-stakes exams demands, and all these systems that we have put in place from schooling to society. I think schools can be a much better place for lifelong learning.
Thank you for sharing your view with us. Do you have any other comment or reflection on this topic? Anybody? Or we can take some questions from floor if you are interested in this question. Do we have any? Okay. We have one question from floor.
Can they hear me?
Yes.
Professor Takayama, this question is to you specifically.
Professor Takayama, can you hear? Okay, would you come to here? Or?
Can you hear me now? Okay. Professor Takayama, the question's for you specifically. It's in response to your talk. But the other panelists, please feel free to respond as well. I'm struck by your discussion of time and how it's diffracted during COVID-19, during the current period that we're going through. And this idea of measuring things differently, such as time, such as the routine that school gives routine to young people. That's a very important part of their life and of our life as academics. Even art, film, music, maybe even love. These things are measured differently today because of COVID. So what I wonder, what I'd like to ask you, is what are your reflections on the new measure of things? How do we measure our life now? How do we measure education today? How do we measure our day under the current situation? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. And the question is to Professor Takayama. Professor Takayama, your microphone is muted, so please turn
I'm
on.
sorry. Yes,
Thank you.
yes. I think I unmuted myself. That's a big question. I mean, I'm not too familiar with any emerging discussions around new measurement. And I'm not quite sure if I actually agree with the idea of measuring something, whether or not, depends on what you mean by that, but I think the notion of measuring is too loaded in my view, so that I find it difficult to imagine measuring something in a way that is radically different from the way the notion is being used at the moment. So I'm not quite sure how to answer your question, to be honest. I guess, but the COVID certainly showed us how the modern sensibilities around time could be ruptured. And this is the moments. So I was trying to describe how that moment arrived to me, and how I was trying to capitalize upon that moment to develop a reflection around teaching and learning, with a particular focus on the notion of time. Because if you look around, the notion of time is so pervasive. It is everywhere. And yet, oftentimes, we don't raise any questions about the time, the temporal assumption that we make in the way we conceptualize research, for example, in the way we organize our teaching and a curriculum. Somehow we accept this modern temporal logic of time, linearity, this progressive notion of time, and we run it. But we know there are many different conceptions of time, circular notion of time, right? If you try to look at how some of the tribal societies before modernity arrived, how they were organized, they were organizing their societies. So there's all these resources out there that we can tap into in order to really imagine radically differently about our society and education. So I guess to me, I'm not really answering your question, Kevin, but I think COVID really provided us an opening for us to imagine differently. And I'd be very, very disappointed if we end up just going back to the way things were. And I think it's time for us to really make a break from the way in which things were done and then start imagining things differently.
Can I make a comment on that?
Okay, please.
Okay.
Professor.
So it's very interesting way of thinking and talking from the other perspective, like Keita Takeyama. But one thing I'm kind of very interested in is that, as I said, a new normal, a kind of concept that we use these days very often, new normal. So what I understand from your perspective, we are now entering into the stage of different normality, not necessarily one normal way of teaching or learning. So there are different normality or normal mode of teaching and learning and education. So after the corona, I expect that this is the only education mode, or this is the correct education mode, but we can expect there are different types of education modes and concepts even. So I see as a kind of positive way as we reflect the previous experiences through the COVID-19. So what I'm saying is that we expect different types of normality as we go through the COVID-19. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lim. And we can approach the schooling system from different perspective. To my best understanding, schooling system was developed in the early 18th century as a part of modern social system, right? And during that time, humankind, we developed government bureaucracy, and military bureaucracy, and schooling bureaucracy. Because of that reason, I think it is time to think about whether still we need school bureaucracy or no, because it is too much standardized. For example, Professor Lim's presentation, he talked about the declining trend of the student achievement in math for low achieving students, right? And is it problem or no problem? From the theoretical perspective, we emphasize competency development, right? Competency is different from student achievement, academic achievement, right? And let's say during the pandemic, the low achieving students, they had a chance to go market near to their home, and then they learn how to spend their money there, right? It is economic education. They had a chance to visit library, museum, and they had a chance to look around their own local community. It is part of education, although their achievement is lowering after pandemic, but in really their learning process was happening there. And then we can say that pandemic has positive impact on their competence development rather than academic achievement development. If that is the case, then we can say that do we need still school system here? We need different type of school system. Like this academic conference, we have hybrid type. One is some audience are in the floor here. The other audience are globally scattered, right? Like that way, our school system still do we need schooling system? That's a big question, actually, I think. And
Okay.
we can talk this issue from this point of view from now on. And then we might discuss the issue in our ICER 2022.
Okay.
Yeah, what do you think about this kind of this ambitious proposal to discuss about the future of the schooling system in the future? Any short comment about within 20 seconds, please?
Okay.
Okay, Keita, are you ready?
Yeah, that's a wonderful proposal. I think it's one way to carry the momentum that was generated as a result of COVID to really deeply rethink the way the modern education has been shaped. So I'll be very happy to be part of the conversation. So thanks very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. And Professor Hong?
Yeah, I think that if we want to have a productive conversation on the future of schooling, and we need to identify, number one, different school systems have different social cultural contexts. So for example, East Asian school systems, we probably understand why the students are from the early part of the morning all the way to the later part of the night, they're doing about the same thing, which is the schooling academics. And we need to figure out why these are the pressure points, and then involve our policymakers and those that make hefty decisions for why schooling is what they are. And then if we are to be clear in painting the future competencies, and it's not just something in the prior to pandemic, it was like more like pronouncements, but now that the pandemic has come, these are more realities that are faced with by our kids. So I think if we create these conversations and start to envision and then operationalize what it means for schools and for policy decisions, I think we will go somewhere.
Thank you, Professor Hong. And lastly, Professor Lim.
Yeah, I think your differentiation between competence and what is called achievement is very interesting. And I'm sure that we will discuss in a different way how we deal with the new school system in terms of competencies and achievement and something like that. So I'm definitely on your side to have a long-term kind of discussion in the future. Okay.
Thank you very much. Again, my appreciation to three presenters for their thoughtful presentation and your creative and smart answers to my stupid questions. Okay. Again, I appreciate your participation to all the audience and the three distinguished professors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.